We spoke too much. Now no one's coming in.
All right. Hello, everybody. A few minor delays, but we're finally here. So we're glad to have all of you here. I see we have 241 watching already. So no pressure, Joshua.
Oh, no pressure at all, man. I only look at you on the other side of the screen anyway.
Exactly. Yeah, Joshua and I are on a Zoom meeting, which is being sent over to YouTube. So if you have any questions or comments, please put that in the chat. I know several of you are using the chat function already. So put your questions there. That way we can answer those questions as efficiently as we can. We can answer those at the end of the presentation, unless there's something pressing. Be glad to answer that quote, have Joshua answer that question. So yeah, before we get started, well, my name is Tyler with Bedford Camera. We have Joshua Needham with Sony, and he's got an awesome presentation for us. So real quick, I feel like I'm a news anchor. I've got my papers here.
All right, Cronkite.
Exactly. Real quick, please like and subscribe to us here on YouTube for other videos. We're going to have other live streams, other pre-recorded content. So go ahead and subscribe there so you can keep up to date on newer videos. And then, oh, Joshua, where are you going to be this week?
I am stopping at a couple of the Bedford Camera locations. Tomorrow I'll be in Little Rock, Arkansas. You'll see me. I'll be there from, I think y'all advertise from open to pretty much almost close, I think 4 o'clock, but pretty much all day. Come see me all afternoon. And then Thursday will be Oklahoma City.
Excellent. Little Rock and Oklahoma City, two big markets of ours. And so if you happen to be nearby and you want to, you either own some Sony equipment or you want to check some of it out, Joshua's your guy. You said Thursday is Oklahoma City. What was Little Rock?
Little Rock's tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Wonderful.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then right in between, we'll have another session, another online webinar.
Yes,
Wednesday.
That's right. Yep. So let's see. We're also doing special trade-in bonuses. So if you want to jump ship and go to Sony, there's additional trade-in opportunities for you. And if you're not fully convinced, Joshua's going to convince you. He's going to be he's going to be the one to convince you during these presentations here. Real quick, we do have some A7 III awesome camera. We have some deals going on for that. So there's some really cool accessories going on when you get that camera. Body in kits available. And they're also, I'm wrapping up here. So there's, we're doing Bedford's doing sales tax paid beginning this weekend, but for you viewers here, that's going to start early. So make sure if you're online, go to when you check out for your Sony or Sony and ProMaster equipment, use Bedford tax at the end of the transaction. That same code will also work if you buy anything in the store. So Bedford is covering the tax on those items, the Sony and ProMaster items in store or online. So yeah, so that was a lot of words. And I don't want to steal the show from you, Joshua. So go ahead and I'll let you take it from here.
Perfect. Yeah, let me queue up at least title screen here. So yeah, today's webinar online session will be everyday macro. We're going to talk a lot about the different macro lenses that Sony has to offer, as well as before we even get started, I'd love to talk about some additional programs, promos that you didn't mention, but also
Joshua, you would also mute your camera. I think sometimes it kind of gets in the way of the slides, the presentation slides for the viewers on YouTube.
Oh, okay. So I'll just do one of those.
There you go. I'm going to mute mine real
Better.
quick.
Great. Cool. Then I can just let me just turn off the webcam real quick. Why power it? Oh, right. So yeah, the Buy More, Save More just launched very recently, but this program we saw about a couple years ago where you buy more than one lens, so minimum 2 eligible lenses here on the screen, and you are eligible for an additional rebate. And so we can find more information on that. You can find me in the store and we can talk about it, or you can go to alphauniverse.com. There you'll find the lens promo for details on how to claim that rebate, since that's going to be a rebate that was sent to you and not instant. But good news is you can always pair this program, this rebate, in addition to the instant rebates that are already offered. So we do see the 90mm macro on the list, in addition to it already being on sale for another $100. So you can save $200 right now on something like the 90mm macro. So talk about something less than $1,000. Now we can make that, and as well as the 30mm macros also on the list, for the crop frame system. So we can take an additional $25 off there. As far as bodies go, I mean, we see a whopping $800 right now in the A7R III. I know you said you had a lot of A7 IIIs, but for you resolution lovers, you pixel peepers, we have $800 off on that body, bringing it to $1999. And can't forget about R4 now, with $500 off. That makes it $29.99. All right. So thank you everyone for joining. If you haven't been on one of my sessions before, or we haven't met in the Bedford camera stores, my name is Joshua Needham. Some people call me the OMG master. At least that's how I am on Instagram. So that's where you can find me. Give me a follow. That's the best way you can reach out to me, because that's my only form of social media, really. Otherwise, I'm working in the digital imaging department with Sony. So in their camera division with Bedford Camera, I support all of the stores. I'll come in and do, you'll see me do counter demos. Sometimes I'll host some classes in person, but for today, we're going online and we're reaching out to the masses. I briefly mentioned Alpha Universe as far as that promo was concerned, but alphauniverse.com is a great resource for all things Sony Alpha, coming down to inspiration, education. You just really, it's the latest on what is going on within the Sony Alpha sphere. Additional resources. I always love to just put these out here because, you know, having a rep contact is definitely a resource, but also being able to find a lot of this information on your own is there. esupport.sony.com will give you everything as far as manuals to firmware upgrades, help guides, which we're starting to see more now. And you can think the help guide as an online manual, but you're able to search for specific functions and recall or bring up a list of everything that's associated with what you are actually searching for in relation to that camera. So every camera has an online help guide, and best way I always say to find that, not only on the esupport.sony.com website, but Google, literally typing model number, let's say A6000 and help guide, will bring that up right away. Additional resources on here, product registration.sony.com. It's good to register your product. I mean, when it comes to associating your name to a serial number in the event you had to service your camera, or even be able to track down that is your camera in some capacity. When we talk about, even with Sony Pro support, we're talking expert support, 24/7 phone and email support. You put yourself into fast, expedited turnaround times as far as repairs go. Also have here Imaging Edge Mobile. For those who don't know, that Sony has an app for controlling your smartphone, for sending images to your smartphone or tablet. That same Imaging Edge mobile app is also software based for the computers. So you can wirelessly or wired tether to your computer, being able to even process the raw images with the edit feature of Imaging Edge is great, because for the most part, that is all free. Class topics today, we're definitely going to be talking about macro. We'll define it. We'll also go through our lenses, what Sony has to offer as far as macro lenses, and what it truly means to be a macro lens. We'll talk about shooting techniques. We'll talk about depth of field within macro, camera settings, some of my tips and tricks when shooting macro. And we'll talk about, and we'll actually look at a lot of example images and talk about composition. So what is macro? Now, in a nutshell, macro is defined as, photographing something extremely close to the camera's lens. So you're bringing that lens right up to the subject, but you want it to be basically full size in relation to the imaging plane or the sensor. What we want to do is capture a life size, or what we'll reference as 1-to-1 reproduction of that in which we're shooting. But do we really care if it's macro or close up? So here in an example, we want to photograph the very small thing that I'm pointing to right here. And so from the outside, this is what macro looks like. And this is what the camera sees when we use those macro capabilities. So we want to bring a life size or more. Some macro lenses definitely have the ability to achieve even greater resolution. And what I mean there is a 2-to-1 aspect. So that way you're photographing double size. And that's what we would say 2-to-1. I've seen macro lenses upwards of 5-to-1. So, bringing in the dragonfly, again, sharp details. And that's a big thing within macro, is that you're going to really bring out a lot of detail, having that full size reproduction. Oh, I don't miss these guys. Not at all. Not living in Texas. Not at all. And even, well, we'll talk about it within the next slide. So additional gear. So when we talk about outside of just a lens, I mean, there are definitely other accessories we should be looking for. A tripod is very crucial, especially if you can adapt accessories to that tripod. Being able to have any kind of flexibility within the column. So the center part of that tripod being able to have a flexible head or more precise head for keeping it very still or making movements outside of just an X and Y change. You can use even a beanbag tripod. So with even using a beanbag for basically stabilizing that camera right down, so you can have foreground or keeping that camera really low to the ground. It all depends on what you want to basically achieve as far as the look goes. Light modifiers are definitely crucial. If we're working outdoors, something like a pop-up diffuser, something we could fold up and put into the bag, that's just going to help us soften the light. We use this also within portraits. It's a great idea. And reflectors can help bounce light onto the subject. And talk about even introducing light, artificial light into the mix, because when we bring that camera and lens very close to the subject, we might be causing some shadow onto the subject, or we want to bring up more detail or introduce more light into other parts of that frame. And so having small pocketable LED light, flash, I've even in some instances use my camera phone flash just to get a little bit more light out of there. But within the LED technology, I mean, we've managed to get relatively inexpensive for the amount of LED power or light power we're adding into the scene. Remotes are a great idea. Outside of just Imaging Edge Mobile being the free app with your phone, you can purchase additional Bluetooth remotes. There are even wired remotes for that way you can just not interrupt the camera for any shake. You can also put on the timer and let it blink for 2, 5, or 10 seconds. Misting bottle. So just adding a little bit more elements into the close-up, especially with flowers, bringing out some detail, just that added extra component of having a little water droplet can really change a lot. And we can apply that with something like an eyedropper. Tweezers, very crucial, getting out that dust, although you can't see it to the eye. you can definitely see it when you start shooting macro in small brush for wiping away any kind of dust. Gaffer's tape works very well too for picking up small things without interrupting the scene. Gaffer's tape is also just a great tool to have in general. And think about it like photographers duct tape. Chip clips, so little clips or even a super clamp is a great idea. And a super clamp is just such a industry standard tool, little accessory for managing a lot of different things. I use a super clamp on my for my webcam, basically clamp right to the column here between two windows, and it actually holds up my camera for many months and never moves. But having that in addition to something like a flexible arm, so like you can add a flexible arm onto your tripod, so that way you can bring light around in front of the subject and not have an additional light stand or anything like that. So probably the most the most popular macro lens that we offer is the 90mm full frame macro. It is a G series lens, offering you a 2.8 aperture. And when we talk about minimum focus distance, just shy of a foot here. And we'll see that minimum focus distance has a lot to do in relation to focal length, right? So here we have a 50mm macro, also full frame, with a 2.8 aperture with a much lower minimum focus distance. And all lenses have a minimum focus distance. It's at that point in which the lens can't get any closer and focus onto that where you're trying to apply focus. In a 30mm macro. So this was the APS-C, or the smaller crop frame lens, with a 3.5 working aperture with a minimum focus distance even lower of a third of a foot up, pretty much. Now, even with some telephotos, could you achieve like macro ability? And so within some of the newer lenses that we've introduced with very close minimum focus distance, we're able to achieve even a 1.4 macro range. So that would be like a 0.25 magnification. Lenses like the 100 to 400 have an extreme close-up a bit focus ability. That would be a GM series minimum focus distance. And again, this is, when we're working at 400mm, we can still focus as close as something as 3 feet. I mean, it is almost like macro. It's you definitely have to take a look at it to see how. It's amazing how close this lens can really focus even at 400mm. And the 70 to 300, also a full frame telephoto lens, has a great minimum focus distance. Again, a lot of lenses have large focus distances, but with even some of these non-macro lenses, it's great that I can get really close to my subjects, as well as with the 70 to 350. Now that lens is for the APS-C lens sensors, but talk about having an equivalent of 525mm and still focus within 3.5 feet, pretty much. So when I talk about that focus distance, again, I go back to it. Basically, here's what that looks like. And so when we relate that minimum focus distance, it's from the sensor, not the end of the lens. So we're achieving 14.5 inches here on the 90mm. We have a little over 9 inches here with the 50mm, and 6 inches here on the 30mm for APS-C. But at those distances with those 3 different macro lenses, we're going to have a very similar composition. Now, details are going to be different. You can see that with the 90mm. So even though the lenses shoot from those very different distances, they all produce a very similar image. And these distances make it more ideal for certain subjects, right? The 90mm for insects is a great idea. So you're not as close, especially if it is something like a bee. A 50mm is very good for product photography. It's a very standard focal length in general, but being able to focus very close to something, maybe something like jewelry, gives it that added difference in compared to other 50 millimeters that we produce, of course. And the 30 millimeter being the only APS-C macro lens, but that doesn't mean you can't take a full frame macro lens and put it on your APS-C camera. You just have to keep in mind that there is a crop factor of about 50% more that is added to that focal length. And you can use macro lenses for more than just macro. You can adjust that limiter switch where you can use the full range of the focus, but you can limit it. So that way, if you're only doing very close work, you're only focusing within a certain range. So that actually gives you faster performance or, more accurate, precise focus. But, for me, my favorite macro lens was also my favorite portrait lens for just the sake of having, they all pretty much work around 2.8. It's the 90 millimeter here we're talking about, but 90 millimeter 2.8. I can work out in a portrait regard since 85 and above lends itself to be a good portrait lens anyway, but I can work my way into the subject and really get something working around the subjects, how I tend to work, which we'll also talk about. And also another thing I didn't mention, but the 90 millimeter is also optically stabilized. So we'll call that OSS, or optical steady shot. So we have image stabilization on that lens as well, which really helps for handheld work. Now with macro lenses and depth of field, what we have to know is that when photographing macro, depth of field becomes incredibly thin. So we have to kind of take control over how much depth we're giving our subject. So here, the starting point on that focus, depth of field, very shallow. Another thing with macro lenses is that depth of field is a very straight or a very linear focal plane. So lenses tend to have a curved focus to them. With macro lenses, it lends itself to be very straight. So that depth of field, the line of separation is very straight. And so here I have another example, photographing a bee with that 90 millimeter, showing how much, even a matter of an inch away, from focusing can move that subject out of focus. So again, talking about depth of field and how shallow something can really be as that subject is moving. And this is also why we should utilize something like burst shooting, especially with macro. If we're working outdoors and there is wind at play, take a series of shots. I mean, these cameras are definitely blessed with shooting more than just one frame per second. We can achieve 10 frames a second. Some cameras will have 20 frames a second. And now we even see 30 frames per second that you can also utilize with cameras like Alpha 1, for example. But you can see here that difference between even a matter of an inch between where it started. And so when I talk about controlling depth of field and using the aperture to control depth of field. So here I'll have my camera and I'll have my focus point. And so I introduce my subject, my focus point on the head, and that depth of field working from the foreground to the background, or the frontmost focus and what's behind for focus. And that's 2.8. So you can see how that depth of field range is really shallow. And as we obviously make that aperture wider, we're going to have a greater depth of field. All the way out to f16, where we can actually achieve the entire subject in focus, but still have the background be completely out of focus. And so again, it's something a little bit more real world, looking at the 2.8 aperture on everything, or something we're all familiar with in terms of size. So here, the dollar bill, as I increase that aperture, so is the focus. Now, some macro lenses allow you to even use above f22. We can stop down to something like f32 on some lenses and really get that whole range in focus. But really seeing those two from 2.8 to f32 here, you can see that difference At least I hope you can see that difference on your side. And introducing even a background to this, here we have our subject and increasing the aperture, the subjects around become more and more in focus. That difference between, again, f32 and f2.8. Now, bear in mind with f32, now we have to realize that we had to increase some other exposure variable, that being shutter speed or ISO. So you really need to make that correlation or that decision on where do I want to either apply more aperture or a faster shutter. But in all, we're really just trying to keep that ISO down. So in a nutshell here, you have your shutter speed scale in relation to aperture, and you can see how I have to increase that shutter speed, or excuse me, let it drag out more as I increase the aperture. And this is why a tripod becomes very crucial to use. Now, again, we have in-body stabilization on a lot of these full frame cameras, and pair that with image stabilization in the lenses, and you can probably absorb some of that handshake and not need to use something like a tripod, because we can manage to shoot 1/30th of a second handheld. You would just get better performance or more consistent performance, in my opinion, when using a tripod in that kind of situation. Now, again, using distance to control depth of field, we're going to shoot all three lenses here at f16 and work our way into the subject using our different lenses. But here we see f11 at about 2 feet away with the details pretty life size. Now we can work our way all the way up to 6 inches on this one. Again, using the 30mm macro, I can get really close to that subject. Now with camera settings, we'll definitely see that Sony offers, some handy tools for kind of making it easier when you're manually focusing. Things like peaking or even the focus magnifier help out tremendously. Peaking, especially even in video, definitely had its role, still does today, of course, but even for macro, being able to visually see where focus is. So imagine that all that red is what are the sharpest pixels in the frame. It's visually seeing where focus is being applied. It's not set on by default, but peaking within your menu is found within, it's deep within the first tab of most of these cameras at this point. That menu has changed a little bit as we change our cameras, but they all lend itself to be relatively in the same place. But turning on peaking and turning on a certain color, so we can actually have peaking be, red, yellow. We can choose blue or even white, depending on what kind of what we are photographing. White might be a good contrast to use. Now, by default, focus magnifier is actually turned on. We'll call that MF assist, as you see right above peaking setting. MF assist will actually, when we turn the manual focus ring on our lenses, when we're in manual focus, we can actually punch in to the subject 6 times, as much as even 12 times, and really fine tune that focus. And you can use focus peaking along with the focus magnifier. So that way you can see very, very accurately, very closely to the subject, where focus, especially if it's very razor thin as shooting in the wider apertures, but being able to use both of those functions in tandem with each other. Again, it's turned on by default, but you could also alter the time in which that magnifier is on the screen. So as we turn that macro, that lens, and we punch into the subject, can we only have that display for maybe 2 seconds? Or maybe when we half press on the shutter, does that preview go away? So we can actually change that with the focus magnifying time, which is on the top of that list there. Now, customizing your buttons. I mean, these cameras at this point, you're pretty much allowed to override all of the default buttons, but we're talking on some full frame cameras upwards of 15 different buttons that can have over 100 possibilities of what they can be. Even some lenses allow you to have the ability to have a custom button. So you can even have a custom setting based on there. And these custom functions can behave by pressing on them or even holding down on the custom. So you could have like a hybrid case in which when you hold down on a particular custom button, do you have a different layout on your camera entirely? And we'll talk about that. But basically within the custom key settings, within the second tab of your camera here, and that's pretty much where it's found on most of the menus, second tab, custom key, you have the option for photo, video, or even playback. So you can have a custom key when you're image reviewing on the rear LCD of your camera, and being able to set functions like a star rating or send to smartphone. Now with the newer menu, you definitely have a more graphical layout as far as when you are applying different custom settings to those cameras. In the previous generation, or pretty much, the first of the full frames, A7, A7R series, after the second generation of those A7 cameras, did you have the previous generation menu, which was down below, but it wasn't showing you a graphical layout of the camera when you were changing your custom keys. You had to kind of just know where C1 was, C2 was. Some of my recommendations for shooting macro and having those custom settings on. These are some things that I like to have the camera set up like. And this is just me. Feel free to screenshot and take a look for yourself. But some features on there that you might not have thought about, especially I love talking about the in-camera guide, being able to, when you're looking at your menu and you're not sure what a certain menu item is, or what does that mean, like what does dial setup mean here, I could actually use a custom key when I'm on my menu and being able to bring up a tooltip or like a help guide within the camera that explains what that function does. And so that's when you're setting your custom key. And again, you have to set this within the camera, within those custom settings, but in camera guide, that's exactly what that setting is doing for you. Now the function menu, this is primarily where, after I'm customizing my buttons, will I put certain features within the function menu. Now I'm kind of either using the function menu to access, or using even custom menus like from my menu to be able to recall settings. But you can think of the function menu as pretty much a roadmap into the camera, kind of giving you those 12 kind of important functions, features that you want to recall right away. Sony does a good job of kind of putting in standard list of items that you would be recalling, but you don't need to have these set by default. You can switch that out. And now at this point, we can switch that out between images and video. So we can have a different function menu for video versus still, because, it's not only macro photography, we can do macro videography, right? But again, you can take out whatever it is you don't use. Like if you don't use a flash at all, take out the flash settings, put something in that you would use. So some things that I definitely look at as far as within the function menu, steady shot, being able to turn off or on when I'm putting my camera onto a tripod, I will turn off steady shot. Now, if your lens has the OSS switch or that IS switch on the lens, you would do it from the lens. So the optical steady shot there, switch on the bottom right, that's where you turn off steady shot if your lens has that switch. Otherwise, you would have to turn it off within the function menu. DRO settings. Dynamic range optimizer definitely helps out in a pinch. It'll apply to the JPEGs, but I do always recommend, if you're using the Adobe software, to shut it off. I've had some instances where DRO, basically the camera processing for dynamic range, or boosting your shadows or recovering some highlight, to have some effect with RAW. And so some users don't want any processing done to that RAW whatsoever. And again, I've only ever really seen this kind of issue with using Adobe software. I would say Imaging Edge Mobile definitely is a good workaround. Creative style, great for basically applying color onto the image. A baked in color, again, it applies to the JPEG just like DRO would. And so if you want to force a color profile of, let's say, black and white, or sepia, or more vivid contrast, there are definitely some more expanded looks to kind of go through, but your creative style function can definitely give you, and use this with RAW plus JPEG shooting, because if your JPEG has that baked in color look, at least you still have the RAW file, which is that RAW image. So if I was shooting in black and white, my JPEG's in black and white, but my RAW stays in color. Another feature I'll put in there is definitely peaking color. I'll switch between different colors because my subject's going to change. If I'm shooting something that is red, I'm not going to have red peaking show, right? I'm going to try to find something that's contrasted to that. Grid lines, which we'll talk about soon, but adding a rule of third grid onto your LCD just as an overlay. We can just do that within the camera. And if you are using a flash, you would want to have the wireless flash option within the camera, toggling on or off when you're applying maybe a remote or a commander of some kind, radio trigger, or if you're using a Sony flash in particular. Now, again, I said our cameras, especially the full frame cameras, boast the 5-axis image stabilization, which really helps a lot for handheld shooting. Gives you about 4 to 5.5 stops of handheld ability. So what I mean there is stability. So what happens is, you got to imagine that if I'm shooting at 1/10 of a second, and if we went up 4 stops from that, so we go from 1/10 to 1/20th, and again to 1/40th, that would be 2 stops. We go to 1/80th, that is 3 stops, and then 4 stops as much as 1/60th of a second. So handheld shooting, 1/10 of a second shutter speed is like if you were shooting at 1/60th of a second, except for motion. Motion still applies the same within the shutter speed. So if something is moving within the frame, you're going to have more increased motion blur if you're photographing lower shutter speeds. Again, I highlight there, I turn off this image stabilization when I'm using a tripod. But here we can see some of those effects with stabilization and those differences within the quality, especially at 100%. And this works well with adapted lenses too. And what I mean there is, Sony makes some great lenses, and within the E-mount system, I like to say that the E-mount system is a very infinite system, because not only do you have 65 lenses to choose from within Sony, but then going native, but then you have other options, even older, like going from an older archaic lens mount, something like a Minolta MD lens mount. We can get a lens adapter pretty easily going from that old 80s Minolta lens onto our current E-mount body. There's virtually, you can get from any lens mount onto E-mount better than other mirrorless cameras. When I'm using a tripod, I will change some of my AF settings around. I will use AFC if my subject is moving. Again, flowers blowing in a breeze. If I can have this amazing autofocus performance that is basically tracking a subject move with my subject, then I can have a greater ability of freezing just that subject in relation to where it is within the frame, because I've kind of explained that we have such a narrow depth of field, but I want my focus to go, my plane of focus to go with the subject. And I'm primarily using a flexible spot, small just to get precise, but also flexible spot to be able to move my focus point around the screen. Now, if the subject isn't moving at all, it's a coin on the table, I'm just gonna put it in AF, or excuse me, I'm gonna put that in manual focus. I'll rely on peaking to show me accurately where focus is happening. Now, single shot with a shutter release, or within your phone, but you have also your self timer that you can use, 2-second delay. If you forgot your remote, or you don't want to use the Wi-Fi. And then we have steady shot. Again, set it off if we're using on a tripod. And I'll move that tripod in and out, because you can just move even an inch in with the tripod and vividly change where that focus is actually being applied. Sometimes I could just like little taps on the legs of the tripod and inching it ever forward. Now, if it's handheld, a little different. AFC, again, if my subject's moving, something like your insects, again, your flowers, but lock-on tracking focus has definitely changed the way that I shoot. Lock-on focus you saw in the A7 III camera, A7R III camera, and in tracking autofocus happened right after that. So tracking autofocus with something like the A7R IV has definitely made it to be so much easier for me to basically apply focus and recompose quickly. Again, I'm still using manual focus if nothing is moving, using my focus peaking, relating it to the color in which the subject is for a contrasted look. So that way I can see where focus is. Now, with your drive mode, again, set it to burst. We have the ability to shoot, 10 frames a second on most of these cameras. Use it, especially if you're outdoors. There's really nothing wrong with doing that. You just have to be wary when using something like 10 frames a second indoors. If you're in your electronic shutter, something with LEDs, you might have some lighting situations that happen. Anomalies like banding might occur, but for the most part with outdoors, it's irrelevant. Handheld, I'm going to keep my steady shot on. And again, hold down the shutter button. So for me, I'm ready to hit the trigger, or I'm just at this point spraying and praying as I lean into my shot. Now, everyday macro was something that was started. We were kind of in a pandemic situation because we were indoors, right? We definitely worked our way outdoors, and we're pretty much back. You can say that you're in some kind of normalcy, but in the event that you are stuck indoors, winter is coming, right? So we might want to photograph indoors. So how do we bring some of that kind of ability when we can just shoot all the time macro photography, right? I mean, not some of us have the ability to go photograph an insect all the time, but that is a fake flower that I'm using. So when I'm talking about shooting indoors, sometimes when I'm shooting those landscape shots, or I am outdoor shooting, I'll actually take some shots in mind to apply as a background later. So I'm outdoors, I'm photographing, and okay, this is interesting. I could use this as a fake background. And what I mean there is I'll photograph it, put on something like a Gaussian blur within, Photoshop, or just blur it out completely. You can even just manual focus rack and, make everything completely out of focus. But I'm printing out that image and making a fake background out of it. And this can work, you can definitely get intricate with it. This is a very quick example of what I mean doing that. All right, so within bringing up ideas of composing, rule of thirds, for example, you can bring up a rule of thirds grid on your LCD to help you compose those shots, because the rule of thirds has definitely adopted its way into many different art forms, but it is a visually important rule to consider, and it does make sense within image making in general, photography, videography. But here we have our rule of thirds grid on, and we're basically taking the subject and trying to intersect that subject on some point. So we find those intersection points, and that's where we want the subject to cross over. Just looking at some examples here. I work the subjects. I pretty much will start at a snapshot and start changing my perspective around that subject. And I've applied this, and this is how I've even learned with portrait photography, but I'll apply it within pretty much all of my shooting in general. Sometimes I'll even start with just a zoom lens, so that way I have some versatility in my shot. And then as I find that I'm working in a certain focal length, will I slap on the relevant prime lens or the corresponding prime lens to kind of get even more effect out of it. So again, I start from that snapshot. I start reducing those background distractions, changing the sides, changing my angle, proximity, and ultimately creating a better image in the end. Sometimes if it's not the first shot I ever taken, it's the immediately last shot and nothing in between. Same thing, work through the shoot. Here, I'm snapping that first image just to capture something, because I might not see that creature ever again. But that background is definitely distracting. So as I have more time, I can change my angle. I can get a bit better. But now even in the background, I got that shed that's kind of in the left, distracting me. So working around again, have a nice, clean background, doesn't distract the subject, and then ultimately continuing to work multiple angles, focusing on the details while they stick around. All right, and that brings me to my my closing.
Well done, sir.
Oh, thank you.
All right, I have a few questions. If you have any questions, please put that in the chat now so we can get to those. We want to make sure we're answering as many questions as possible. So I have a few questions we can go over while we get maybe a few more if somebody has any more questions. Joshua, we really appreciate that. That's this is always a good skill to have. And it goes beyond bugs and frogs and stuff, which is an awesome that's a good subject to go to. But even rings and small food, things like that, there's so much you can do with macro, so that it's such a cool skill to have. So the first one is, can you achieve macro type results without a dedicated macro lens?
Yeah, and it just all comes down to what that magnification is going to be with that lens. Again, some close focus that we can achieve with some telephotos, and even some wide angles. Yeah, some of the newer wide angles, like the 20mm 1.8 has a 0.25 magnification. So again, that's going to be a 1:4 macro. So getting 1:1 is definitely going to be the idea of bringing that lens extremely close to the subject, so that way you're projecting a life-size image. So I've ever seen 1:2 in a telephoto lens, as far as, almost 0.5 magnification basically. But I haven't seen a telephoto, non-macro lens offer me 1:1 basically, is what I mean to say there.
Yeah. And I think piggybacking on that, I had somebody ask early on. They said, "What are the differences? What are the differences between shooting a 35 versus a 90mm?" And I think it was James that was asking this. And correct me if I'm wrong, James, but there are some lenses, like some wider, some, like, I know the 24 and the 35 have some close focusing capabilities. But you're going to get a different look with that wide than you would with a dedicated 90 or 105 or 200mm focal length. Obviously, there's going to be a magnification difference. But Joshua, could you speak on to how those wides, I guess, optically, what it's doing versus something like a 50 on a crop or a 90 on a full frame?
Yeah. So ultimately, as you have a tighter focal length, you're offering more compression onto that subject. So you're actually bringing the background into the frame. And you're going to have an exaggerated depth of field, right? So if I was really close to the subject with a wider lens, not only do I see more background, but more background will be in focus, or that depth of field isn't as exaggerated. And so that's why, lenses like an 85 and above lend themselves to be almost perfect portrait lenses, focal lengths for portrait lens, because anything wider than that, you could work with a 50mm as a portrait, but you're not getting that compression. You definitely make features wider, so the face might look apparently wider than if you were using something like a 100mm.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you needed to show more of the environment and give the audience an idea of more of the environmental side of what you're shooting, sure, you can certainly, I keep going back to the 24-1.4 G Master, which is an awesome lens. Yeah, you can certainly, I've seen photos of like small flowers and mushrooms, like your camera's all the way to the ground, and you're getting that one item in focus, but you're still getting a lot of the atmosphere. So I guess it depends on the look you're going for. Are you trying to isolate something, or are you trying to get a grander perspective? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. Is introducing more of that background and that environment. I think you put it right.
And then, there was some interesting comments about there were some people that were that used this, and some that certainly did not use it. The subject of focus stacking came up a few times. So the main question was, does focus stacking have a place in macro photography? I'm interested to hear your perspective on that.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, if you really want that control of being able to have a greater field of focus, or being able to control that even in post, right? Because if I'm taking all these images, I basically have that entire range of focus to kind of manipulate with. So it's, whether you're doing it in camera right away or you're doing it in post. Unfortunately, we don't offer the focus stackability within in camera. It does lend itself to be software based. So it does mean that you're using not only increasing apertures, but using items like a focusing rail to make more precise movements forward and back. So that way you can have an increased, it's ultimately for detail, increased detail, especially when we talk cameras like having 61 megapixels. I mean, think about how much detail and resolution you can combine.
Exactly. And I haven't done it a lot in camera. I've done it the manual way of doing it, by setting my focal length, basically setting up my composition, and then using the focus peaking lines and starting from the front to the back, and then letting the software, and then pretty much it's hard to find software that doesn't do it now, because all of them, if not many of them, if not all of them, are at least adding that feature very soon. I mean, they're all being very competitive with each other, and I've had some success with that. I set it at f8, and then I'll watch the focus peaking lines and just do several steps at a time. I think I've done about 20 or so just to make sure I covered everything.
Right.
It worked pretty well. I haven't experimented a lot with it, but it's certainly something to play with and see if it works in your workflow.
Yeah, and it also comes down to like how small is that item that you're photographing. I mean, focus stacking can definitely lend itself to be a very useful tool. Like, let's say, like, I don't know, the most shortage thing right now is a semiconductor, photographing a tiny little semiconductor. Even with just a standard, shot of a focal length and increased aperture might not be enough. I might need to actually have multiple shots going in and out around that chip,
Absolutely. And real quick, I've had a few people ask recently, is this being recorded? Yes, it's being recorded. As soon as we get off live here, you will be able to watch it again here on YouTube. So make sure that, if you need to catch up, maybe take some more notes. I know Joshua had some excellent information. Feel free to watch it back as many times as you want to. I'm not sure how long it will, how many more weeks it will be on there, but, get that information for sure. This is an excellent skill to have, but this is being recorded. You'll be able to watch it again. So let me mark that one off. Let's see. Oh, and someone was also asking, is there an alternative to focus peaking in Canon? Yes and no. In the mirrorless segment, so whether it's Sony, Fuji, Nikon, Canon, all those, they all have focus peaking. On the mirrorless side, that's just the way that technology is designed to work. On the DSLR side, you may or may not have it. So it's the same term. At least Joshua, I've seen it be the same term across all the brands. I think it's just a commonly used term. So I would look for that inside your camera if you don't have a Sony.
Yeah. And then now, even with cameras like, Alpha 7 IV, we introduced what is the focus map feature. So not only are you seeing the sharpest points of focus, represented by color, but you can actually represent the entire depth of field. So, completely out of focus to like almost focused to focused, represented as color. So you could really see that transition.
Yeah, absolutely. I have two more questions, unless there are some last minute ones. So please put that in. We'll get to these and then I'll check it again. This was interesting. It was more of a not so much a question, but a comment, something you could try. I've tried this a few times. Somebody's saying there's an idea if you can use like a larger iPad or like a larger tablet or a TV with a photo as the background. And Josh was nodding his head. Yeah,
I've seen people do that with like video too. Like they'll use like a panning shot as a background to make it look like they're moving inside something, So I've seen that effect. I've also used my reflection from my screen as a foreground for my subject. So that way it's like a glass kind of reflected surface. I've done that before with like a tablet or even my phone.
Absolutely. And I've done that with my TV at home, because it's, especially if I'm shooting a little bit wider, well, as long as I'm within the frame, I can make it look good. I mean, if you need to blur it out, especially if you have like a field on the back, on your TV, it can look pretty good. Just make sure you light it properly, the item properly.
Yeah.
And let me check, make sure, are any other questions? Oh, okay. So a few people are asking about this. What about extension tubes? What are your feelings on extension tubes?
I mean, they definitely have their place. Obviously, Sony doesn't make any extension tubes within the E-mount system, but they are definitely available through some third-party, applications. Some even giving you retaining autofocus. Some don't retain the autofocus, and then you're just stuck to manual. We'll call that like a dumb adapter, but at least, or dumb extension tube or a simple one. But having the autofocus, translate over, you might, they work. They definitely work, and they'll work not only with macro lenses for pushing that minimum focus distance, but it's also going to work and help with some of the zoom lenses that have larger minimum focus distances to kind of increase that a little bit too.
Yeah, absolutely. And in my experience, you do lose, or you have the possibility of losing the infinite focus capability of that lens. So if you need infinite focus, you're clearly not using macro, so you won't need the tubes anyway.
Right.
And another person was asking, is this being recorded? Yes, this is being recorded. This will be on YouTube as soon as we get off the live stream here, so you'll be able to watch that basically immediately. I've seen YouTube putting this up, processing this pretty much immediately. So feel free to take notes, fill in what you missed out. Another person asking about additional equipment. You mentioned it a little bit about focusing rails. How often do you use focusing rails?
Almost none. I was just saying in that relation to focus stacking, but no, I don't. Although again, another kind of inexpensive item that you can definitely add on to your tripod.
Yeah,
but I don't.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if it's something, if it's a bug that's moving, you're probably not going to be able to, respond quickly enough to that bug moving. But in those cases, especially if you, at least I've noticed this, if you have a ball head, if you loosen that ball head, well, it's going to be a big movement, especially when you're magnifying that much. So a focusing rail may be useful to you, so you can make those fine-tune adjustments, forward, backward, left, right. So let's see. I just want to make sure we're covering everything else. And just again, feel free to subscribe here on YouTube. We have other live streams that we've done. We have some other pre-recorded content about equipment and events we've done. So feel free to subscribe here so you can keep up to date on those. And Joshua, would you put up your contact information again, just in case there are those who missed it? That way they can keep up to date on all the cool stuff you do.
You get my Instagram, you're not getting my phone number.
There you go. Yeah. Oh, come on, man.
You meet me in person, you might get my phone number.
What about your fax number?
Thankfully, Sony doesn't make fax machines, I don't think.
Hey, there you go. Yeah, follow Joshua on Instagram there. He's got some cool stuff. So let me double check the chat one more time. James goes, do they sorry, I read it wrong. He said, I thought he said, do they still make DSLRs? That's not what he said. He said, do they even make them for DSLRs? I'm not sure which one. Probably DSLR, or probably focusing rails. I'm not sure. James, I'm sorry. I read your comment wrong in it, but it made me laugh. Yeah. So I just want to make sure there aren't any other additional questions. Oh, someone, I think, there it is, James. I read your other comment above that. What about an auto bellows for still subjects?
Whoa, that would be, useful. I'm definitely not familiar with that in my personal experience.
Yeah, that's beyond me too. Yeah, that I'm not too sure about. Well, appreciate all of you for showing up for this class. There are a lot of great deals going on. For those of you that looking at some gear, I know there's some lens deals going on that Sony has, as well as if you're in the Oklahoma City or Little Rock area, you're going to be able to see Joshua in person. So if you're able to come by and see him and see gear and ask him tons of questions, as well as our other Bedford staff, They're going to be there to help you out and guide you in the right direction for what type of photography and videography you do.
That's right. Tomorrow, Little Rock. Thursday, OKC.
Yes, sir. All right. Well, we'll let everybody go on about their day. And we have another live stream on Wednesday, correct?
Yes.
Yes, Wednesday with Joshua. So we'd love to have you sign up for that and bring your questions, bring a notepad, make sure you write down your questions and all your notes. So we appreciate all of you, and we hope to see you on the next one.
Thank you, everyone.